Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Dragon Ball Xenoverse for PC, Xbox 360, Xbox One, PlayStation 3, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a hybrid of several genres, but most notably the fighting game, specifically 3D fighting, and action-adventure with RPG elements, and it was developed by Dimps and published by Bandai Namco in 2015. It went on to have a fairly mixed reception overall, with the general consensus being that it has a lot of problems, but Dragon Ball fans in particular will probably be able to get something out of it. And while it will probably surprise most of you out there who know I generally like anime, I've never really liked Dragon Ball all that much. Sure, it has a lot of cool flashy moves, and the fights themselves can be kind of interesting to watch, but the vast majority of it is just people sitting there powering up for about 20 episodes before something actually happens, and it's always the same exact tired formula over and over and over again, which is as follows. Big bad guy shows up probably trying to destroy the Earth for some incredibly stupid reason, so the Z-Fighters have to train in order to beat him. And thus they have their bit of a training montage, they power up for several episodes, and then they actually fight the guy. And obviously things don't go well until eventually somebody unlocks yet another transformation, and then they beat the big bad guy, and life goes on, until the next big bad guy shows up and the cycle repeats itself. This is why one of the general complaints about the game just being very repetitive tends to amuse me, because I can just look at people and go, wait, have you never seen Dragon Ball before? Do you not know what Dragon Ball is? Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily absolve it of repetition, but you should go into a Dragon Ball game accepting at least some degree of fairly heavy repetition, because that's just a trope of the anime itself. A very annoying one, I might add, but even then, if you go into this knowing what you're getting into, even if you're not necessarily a Dragon Ball fan, what are you going to get? Well, let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out. Well, as far as presentation goes, it definitely looks the part of a Dragon Ball game. It has the right art style that's in keeping with what you see in the manga and anime, and it has lots of bright, colorful things going on. It has some pretty flashy animations for a lot of the special attacks, which range from things like some relatively basic fireball attacks all the way up to really powerful beams, or various explosion attacks, or creating large orbs of energy and throwing those at opponents. Any number of these various attacks that feel right at home in Dragon Ball, and most of which you have seen in the anime. And if it's not necessarily familiar to you, then there's a good chance that it came from one of the OVAs or movies, and while those aren't necessarily canon, they actually fit in with the continuity of Xenoverse as well, because Xenoverse deals with alternate timelines and alternate universes. And one of the interesting side effects of it looking the part of a Dragon Ball game is that it can kind of skirt around some of the visual quality issues it has. I mean, the textures aren't particularly high quality, and in fact a lot of the backgrounds have rather low-res textures, but that's not necessarily a problem. It's going for a bright, colorful, cartoony anime art style, and that's exactly what it pulls off. So it doesn't necessarily need to look better in terms of visual quality than it actually is. And of course it does help that the game runs at a rather smooth 60 frames per second, so there's none of that janky animation going on either. And speaking of animation, the game does feature a couple of cutscenes that are actual anime as opposed to being in-game renderings, and those actually end up looking a bit better than the visuals in the game do. I mean, in the game you're dealing with really terrible lip syncing, and that's even for anime standards, so that's pretty impressive. And I don't mean that the lip syncing doesn't match up to the English dub, because you pretty much expect that with an anime game. In this particular case, the lip syncing doesn't even match up with the Japanese voice acting, so there's something weird going on with that. But apart from the lip syncing issues and the occasional graphics glitch, a lot of clipping issues in particular, which is not really all that unusual for a game like this, honestly, there's really not that much wrong with the visuals. The visuals certainly won't be winning any awards, but they get the job done, and they get it done rather well. The same can't necessarily be said for the sound design, however. The sound effects themselves all fit in extremely well. They're exactly what you would expect from Dragon Ball if you've seen the anime or seen one of the movies or anything like that, because they're actually using sounds that are pretty much ripped directly from that. The same kind of goes for the voice acting. The cast is, from what I can tell, the same cast for the anime, so they've done a good job with that, although a lot of the voice acting is certainly very cheesy, particularly in the English dub. But of course, the source material is cheesy as hell too, so that's not necessarily a problem, it's just something you kinda have to get used to. So at least in terms of the sound effects and the voice acting, it sounds the part of Dragon Ball, and that should be certainly praised. But then there's the soundtrack. And that's where things get a bit tricky, because depending on which version of the show you've watched, the soundtrack can be wildly different. The original Japanese tends to have a lot of J-pop in it, there's even some J-rock as well, but it was mostly some instrumental stuff that worked okay for the show, but it really didn't hit its stride unless you're dealing with some pretty hard rock like you'd got in the original airing of the show in the US, where Bruce Faulconer redid the soundtrack. And Bruce Faulconer's soundtrack is pretty frickin' awesome. I mean, really, what goes better with a completely goofy, over-the-top show about people blasting each other with gigantic energy beams than a bunch of kind of cheesy hard rock? It's kind of a match made in heaven there. But you don't even get the traditional Japanese soundtrack for Dragon Ball with this. Oh no, you get the Xenoverse soundtrack, which tries to get you psyched up to play the game with a piano tune that will probably put you to sleep if it doesn't give you a migraine to start with, because it's the same about 4 or 5 notes repeated on pretty much endless loop. Oh sure, the anime intro to the game gives you some J-pop, but beyond that, you're dealing with some relatively bland electronic music and of course the piano tune at the beginning, which plays during pretty much all of the menus. So that starts to grate on your nerves after a while, and even beyond that, there's not really much rock in the soundtrack to speak of, and what little there is just some fairly wimpy stuff that's very repetitive loops. And none of the music really does anything for the game. It just kind of gets in the way more than anything else. You may be sitting there having a really intense battle, and it's just playing a very repetitive tune that has no sense of urgency whatsoever. It's just annoying. So while the rest of the presentation looks and sounds like a proper Dragon Ball game, the music just doesn't, and it ends up letting the whole thing down as a result. But while nailing the look and sound of Dragon Ball was certainly important, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this involves the player character being part of the Time Patrol, which is led by the Supreme Kai of Time, basically the goddess of time. And you're going back into history and trying to prevent various alterations that are being made by a couple of characters named Mira and Towa, who are trying to disrupt the timeline in order to gather enough energy to restore the demon realm and thus basically merge all realms into the demon realm. It's a really, really stupid story, even for Dragon Ball standards. Basically, it exists to try to give you a reason for you going back and messing around with various events in the existing Dragon Ball saga, starting with the moment where Raditz goes to Earth and everybody has to try to beat him, going all the way up to the beginning of Dragon Ball Super, which at that time was just the Battle of the Gods movie. Now look, the writing in the Dragon Ball series has never been the strong suit, but even with that in mind, Xenoverse's writing is just awful. The protagonists seem to have the intelligence of a slab of granite, and the villains themselves have motivations so paper thin that it's painfully obvious that they were written as "Mwahaha, we are villains because we are evil and we do evil for evil's sake because we can." And it's also painfully obvious that they took the Time Patrol route, not because they actually wanted to do anything remotely interesting with a time travel storyline, but because they just wanted to include a bunch of characters and events from the actual anime. So what elements of the story are original are just plain crap, and the elements of the story that aren't original are just rehashes from the anime, so there's really nothing to go on there. What ultimately really matters is the gameplay. And that's where things do get rather interesting, because conceptually, Xenoverse's gameplay elements are perfect for a Dragon Ball game. When you start the game up, you are presented with the character creation screen, and you create your own custom character to wander around the universe of Dragon Ball in. There are 5 races to choose from. Of course, Saiyan is one of them, and you can be male or female Saiyan. You can be a male or female Earthling. You can be a male or female Majin, which is like Majin Buu. And you can also be a Namekian, which are only male, or a member of Frieza's race, which are also only male. Each of these does does have different abilities. For example, of course, Saiyans are the only ones who can become Super Saiyans, but they also have low health and high attack power, whereas the Earthlings have constant ki regeneration and generally balanced characteristics, and the Majin have high defense but low recovery. After you select your character's race, you're presented with a variety of visual customization options, from hairstyles to the way their eyes look and that sort of thing, as well as, of course, their voice, which is really just a bunch of grunts, yells, and screams, so there's really nothing going on there. Unfortunately, the protagonist doesn't say anything throughout the entire course of the game. They just glare at things, or they nod or shake their head, or that sort of thing. Sometimes they will say the name of an attack. For example, Kamehameha. Of course they're going to say Kamehameha when they use it. It's a requirement. But other than that, the choice of voice is really more of your personal preference of how they sound when they're getting the crap kicked out of them. Which is probably going to happen quite a lot at the start, because once you get through the character customization, you actually get into the game proper, you find that it's got a lot of RPG elements, particularly in stats. As you play the game, you will of course gain experience points, and you will eventually level up, which will then grant you a bunch of ability points that you can put into a series of stats. These stats are all pretty straightforward as well. There's one for your health, there's one for your ki, which is basically your mana in this game, or your energy points, or whatever you want to term it. It's whatever you use for special attacks. And then there's a stat for increasing your stamina, which is primarily used whenever you're using fast flight, or you're trying to use the skip dodge maneuver where you instantly jump right behind the enemy while they're attacking you. And then there are 3 stats for increasing the amount of damage you do. One of them is for your basic attacks, one of them is for strike supers, which are basically just melee supers, and then there's one for ki blast supers, which are all the things like the Kamehameha or other sorts of energy blasts that you use. And of those stats, the ones you'll probably notice the most are the ki and stamina, because every 25 points in those adds an additional bar to your meter. You'll also notice your health meter getting larger and larger as you put more points into the health stat, but you probably won't notice all that much when you're putting points into the various attack bonuses, because those are such a minuscule amount per point that it takes quite a lot to really add up to anything substantial. And the stats are further compounded by the equipment system, where you select what outfit your character is wearing, and instead of just going for whatever you think looks cool, all of it actually has stats of its own, and those all correspond to various point amounts in the actual stat system. So for example, if you put on an outfit that has -5 to Ki Blast Supers, then that means you effectively have -5 points to whatever your current total is for Ki Blast Supers. Now of course, in the case of the various damage bonuses, that's a pretty minuscule amount anyway, so it's not that big of a deal, but it is more of a deal for the health, ki, and stamina meters, which also have bonuses and detriments in the equipment. So instead of being able to customize the look of your character however you want, including outfits, you're going to pick whatever outfit is complementary to your build. Or at least you're going to do that up until you get to rather high levels, and the stat bonuses and detriments that you get from the equipment aren't really that big of a deal to you anymore, so that can get pretty annoying. But apart from the health, ki, and stamina meters being particularly important, there's also the matter of what abilities you have equipped. You can have 4 supers and 4 ultimate abilities, one of which is reserved for an evasive ability. The evasive abilities consume stamina, but they let you get out of a sticky situation either by simply not taking damage, or repelling enemies away from you while also not taking damage, or things like that. The rest of the super and ultimate moves either use ki, or in some cases they don't use anything at all. For example, if you decide to activate the various charge moves, they actually generate ki at the cost of you just having to sit there and not do anything while holding that button down for a while. Now this is where the game can seem kind of daunting at first, because when you start the game you have very few abilities and they're all pretty much garbage, so you have to train in order to get new moves. This is where it being a Dragon Ball game actually comes into very sharp focus, because that's pretty much exactly what happens in the original source material. People train, they learn new moves, and they get better at fighting. That is exactly why Xenoverse is a fantastic idea for a Dragon Ball game. It's pretty much exactly what the show is, but you get to make your own character and you get to use all these really cool moves. So how do you learn all these new moves? Well, there's basically 3 ways you're going to get it. The first and simplest is to buy them in the skill shop with Zenny. Zenny is the in-game currency that you earn by completing missions and selling various items that you find while you're playing the game. As you progress through the story, you're going to find more and more abilities are popping up in the store, so you may just have to wait until eventually they show up. Another way you can get them is by going on the various parallel quests. Parallel quests are something that can either be done offline or online, and the idea is they're just kind of side missions that you can go on, and the in-game lore reason is that they're alternate parallel timelines that are created by all kinds of nonsense with what's going on in the main story. So if you go into the parallel quests and you examine them in the menu and go to the right to where it lists all the rewards, sometimes it will have various special abilities listed. These can be just about anything from super attacks all the way up to ultimates and that sort of thing. There is, of course, a problem with the way that they've set up the reward system for these parallel quests, however. And that is that it's based entirely on RNG. And it is very, very heavy RNG, to the point where you might have to play through a parallel quest once and get that reward that you were looking for, or you might have to play through it over 100 times before it finally gives you the reward you want. Which is especially irritating if you're going for, say, a specific piece of equipment or even a special move, because you can get multiple copies of the same equipment, but you can only get one copy of that special move, and you might not get that special move, but instead get about 40 or 50 different copies of the same item. And the rewards you get from these parallel quests are from a list of items that are the specific rewards available for that quest. And those can be anything from consumables all the way up to even transformations or super moves or just various pieces of equipment, whether that be clothing or super souls. Super souls being kind of a stat boosting item that gives you very, very specific bonuses. But that will lead me more into something that I want to talk about a bit later, so let's hold off on the super souls for the time being. Point is that your performance in the game is ultimately going to be based on how much grinding you are willing to do. If you're not willing to do any grinding at all, you're going to be crap throughout the entire game, and you're probably going to find it is just too difficult at certain points to be able to progress. Now, if you're like me and you can't stand grinding in video games, then that's a pretty nasty problem, because that means that a huge chunk of the game is going to irritate the crap out of you. Especially considering that the vast majority of your grinding is going to be with those parallel quests, and that means you're going to be getting a lot of randomized rewards that you probably don't want. This will lead you to one of the other two methods of gaining your various supers and ultimates, which are, like I said before, going to the store after certain points in the story, and the other method, which I haven't talked about yet, which is finding a master. Now, there are various characters scattered throughout the city that you run around in that will teach you various moves, and as you progress with your relationship with that master, they'll give you different moves along the way. So, for example, if you go and talk to Vegeta, he'll start off by giving you Gallic Gun, and then as you progress through his training, you'll get access to new moves like the Finish Break, and eventually, once you've finished his progression entirely, he will give you his ultimate move, Final Flash. Unlike with the various moves that will show up in the shops, you can only get these moves by training with these masters, so you'll probably want to go ahead and do that if, in particular, there's one that you really want. So if you're a really big Vegeta fan and you really want Final Flash, then you're probably going to go up to him and try to train with him. Here's the problem. The way that the training with the masters works is by grinding. You have to go on various missions and bring that master along with you, and you have to use their various special moves quite a lot. And the game does a beyond terrible job of telling you how far it is until the next milestone, because it doesn't tell you at all. So no matter how you slice it, when you're wanting to get new supers and ultimates, you're going to have to grind, whether that be just through going through the story in order to access new stuff in the shop, or in order to get the amount of money that you need in order to buy the things instead shop, either going on parallel quests, or going on those parallel quests to get those various supers and ultimates anyway, or by training with the masters, which still necessitates going through the parallel quests anyway. This is where I can very easily see people complaining about the repetitive nature of the game, because you are doing the exact same things over and over and over again, whether it be simply for one specific drop that you really want, or it be because you're going on the master progressions and you're just trying to level up your relationship with those masters. And it really doesn't help that the actual level structure is extremely repetitive as well. You're going on missions in the same locations over and over and over again, and on top of that, you're doing the exact same objectives over and over and over again. Those are going to be things like defeat a specific enemy, or collect all the Dragon Balls. And that's pretty much it. There's really no variance in the objectives whatsoever. Even the main story missions don't really have any variance in them. In fact, they have less, because there's the Great Ape mission, and then there's just defeat the enemies or reduce them to a certain amount of health. And that's really it. And even when the Great Ape shows up, the objective is still the same, defeat the enemy. It's just the way you fight it that changes, and that is that in order to actually do damage, you have to break through its blocking, and that puts it into a state of trying to recover its stamina, and it's at that point where you can actually dish out damage. Again, I can very easily see where people would be complaining about repetition, because you're really only doing one or two things this entire game, and it takes quite a long time to do it, and there's a lot of grinding involved. And if it were just the extreme amount of repetition, that would be one thing, but there's also a really nasty problem this game has, which is its horrendously unbalanced difficulty. By the time Frieza shows up in the game's storyline, you are encountering enemies with an absolutely absurd amount of super armor and damage resistance in particular, especially when they're doing ultimate attacks. Because it turns out, as long as you have stamina in your meter during an ultimate attack, you will not take damage during it. And of course, the AI basically ignores the stamina requirement entirely, so they're constantly pulling off ultimate attacks, which they can take absolutely no damage during. This leads you towards playing the game in a very specific way, which is basically just to spam ultimate attacks over and over and over again, hoping that it's enough to take the enemy out before they take you out. Of course, there's a fair bit more to the combat system than simply the ultimate and super attacks. I mean, obviously you have those, but you also have basic combos you can do with a variety of light and heavy attacks, all of which gradually build up your ki meter. And of course, in addition to the basic attacks, there's also a basic throw you can do. There's a basic ki blast you can perform, which barely does any damage, and you can perform a barrage of those attacks as well. And unlike supers and ultimates, those particular ki blasts don't actually require any use of your ki meter. And if you find yourself stuck in an enemy's combo, you can press the jump button in order to vanish out of their combo and appear behind them at the cost of 2 bars of your stamina meter. But you have to be careful, because as you block and as you use the vanish, then your stamina meter is depleted, and once it's fully depleted, then there's a period where you can no longer block or vanish until the bar has regenerated completely. Now that only takes a few seconds, but it is still something that you'd need to keep in mind. There's also the ability to perform a just guard, which is basically, if you're familiar with other fighting games, a perfect block, where if you perform it at exactly the time that your enemy's attack hits you, then you take no damage, and unlike a normal block, which uses stamina, it doesn't use any stamina, and it actually replenishes a bar of your ki as well. So as far as the combat basics go, they are fairly simple, but there is some depth there, and there is some room for you to get skilled at it. But unfortunately, the way they've set up the game in terms of its difficulty, in terms of how much super armor the enemies have and that sort of thing, as well as the way they've set up the ultimate attacks, just renders the basic combat system pretty much pointless, unless of course you're playing online against someone who's a good sport and will actually try to use the combat system properly. But of course, at this point, pretty much everybody has already moved on to Xenoverse 2, so there's not really an online community to speak of. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the best solution is basically to break the game. To give you an idea of how hilariously unbalanced this game is, let me explain my current character build to you. I played as a Saiyan, which gives me access to Super Saiyan 1 and 2, or the alternate versions, which I actually prefer for my particular build, which are Super Vegeta 1 and 2. Super Saiyan 1 and 2 and Super Vegeta 1 and 2 differ only in one aspect, which is that if you're Super Vegeta, then your Ki Blast attacks are enhanced, whereas if you are a Super Saiyan, then your melee attacks are enhanced. Regardless of which one you use, they both have the same drawback, which is that they slowly drain ki until eventually the ki bar is completely depleted, and once it's completely depleted, then you basically enter a stamina break. To remedy this problem, one of my super abilities is a charge ability. In my particular case, as of doing this review, it's Maximum Charge, which is the most powerful one you can get. It regenerates your ki extremely quickly. Which is important because once you're in Super Saiyan or Super Vegeta, then your ki can no longer be replenished by doing attacks. That may sound like it's an especially dangerous proposition, except that it's not, because once you're in Super Saiyan or Super Vegeta, your supers and ultimates no longer cost any ki at all. Let me rephrase that. As long as you're in Super Saiyan or Super Vegeta, you have infinite supers and ultimates. This means that you can just continually pop out ultimates that enemies can't damage you during, at least until your stamina runs out. So you're thinking, okay, well keep up the onslaught during those ultimate attacks and eventually you can still take the character down. Well, that was certainly the case until I did two things. The first thing was to complete Cell's master progression and unlock the perfect Kamehameha, which is arguably the best ultimate in the entire game because it does an absolutely insane amount of damage. This is especially true if you remain under Cell's tutelage the entire game and you get access to his Z-Assist. Z-Assists are something that the Masters give you once you have unlocked their ultimate, and whenever you use their ultimate, there is a very high chance that it will trigger the Z-Assist, which will give you a very sizable damage boost. So of course, I equip Perfect Kamehameha, I still have Cell as my master, and I also equip a special Z-Soul entitled No More Games, which gives me a damage boost to my Perfect Kamehameha regardless of whether a Z-Assist is triggered or not, and in fact it stacks with the Z-Assist, so I can do even more damage when that triggers, and on top of the damage boost, it makes me completely immune to all damage during Perfect Kamehameha. Not just health damage, but stamina damage too. So basically, once this character goes into Super Saiyan mode, the fight is over. It completely trivialized everything in the game, and just made it a complete joke. But that's actually the biggest problem with the game. Either it is laughably easy thanks to the hilariously broken character builds you can put together, or, if you haven't gotten to the point where you can put together that build yet, it is so punishingly difficult in the BS way that it's basically the equivalent of the game extending both middle fingers and laughing in your face. Because every last bit of difficulty in this game is completely artificial. It is not from requiring you to master the mechanics or requiring you to master the techniques involved in the actual fighting. It is entirely from just completely stacking the deck against you through excessive amounts of RNG in the rewards, so you're just going to have to grind until eventually you get what you need in order to complete your build. It is from giving you constant enemies that have ridiculous amounts of super armor and that can just continually spam ultimates and take no damage during them. And it is from things like auto-tracking attacks that you really can't avoid, so you have to hope your stamina holds out long enough to survive the attack, or you can just fight fire with fire and use exploits that completely break the game but are perfectly well within the game's rules, like what I did and built my completely broken-ass character. And as if to add insult to injury, there is one final middle finger the game gives you, but it didn't give you that until Xenoverse 2 came out, which is, Xenoverse 2 has a save import feature. You can import your save from the previous Xenoverse in order to not only see your character in the events of Xenoverse 2, but you also import all of the abilities that that character had equipped on them at that time, unless they meet certain requirements. Certain requirements include no transformations at all, so you can't import Super Saiyan or Kaioken or anything like that, and you can't import any of the God of Destruction abilities. But other than that, everything else was fair game, and once you import that character into Xenoverse 2, you have all of those abilities right from the start. So you can actually just equip a bunch of endgame abilities like Super Kamehameha, which you can only get once you max your level out and you complete Goku's training, which is the same case in Xenoverse 2, I might add. You have to beat the game in order to get access to Goku's training. And so you can have Super Kamehameha right from the start. It also imports all of the clothing that particular character was wearing, so if you have a particular outfit you really like and you didn't unlock it until later, you can equip it on that character, import it into Xenoverse 2, and now you have access to all of that on your new created character for Xenoverse 2 as well. This ultimately means that even though the original Xenoverse is absolute misery to play through because it is an absolute disaster of a game, it still has significant, tangible benefits for if you decide to play through Xenoverse 2 as well. And that is downright infuriating for one very simple reason that I will expand on a lot more when I get around to reviewing Dragon Ball Xenoverse 2. But the really short version is that Xenoverse 2 is an absolutely massive improvement over the original game, to the point where it's kind of staggering that they actually came from the same developer. Because Xenoverse 1 is absolutely awful, and I really cannot remotely recommend it to anyone, even Dragon Ball fans. It's just that messy of a game. I mean, let me put it this way. There were so many times when I was playing this for this review that I was really tempted just to instantly stop playing and give it less than a 1 out of 5, something like a 0.5 out of 5, just because it was infuriating me so much. But it's not quite that bad. It's definitely playable. It's definitely pretty much bug-free, except for some very inconsequential stuff. And it's a very good idea on paper, it's just that the execution was absolutely awful. So ultimately, I give it a 1.5 out of 5. But again, the sequel is so much better, so stay tuned for that review, and I'll explain more about that. Thanks for watching.